In the forests of Colorado, two men find something that shouldn't exist. What lies beneath will shock you. Subscribe, like, and tell us where you're watching from. The forest in early autumn spread wide across the mountains near Aspen Ridge, Colorado, glowing with the amber of fading leaves and the scent of pine sap rising from the earth. Jack Miller trudged along the narrow mountain trail, his boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. The sun had begun to dip behind the jagged ridges, and long blue shadows stretched across the clearing. Behind him, Ethan Cole followed, a younger man with an eager energy that contrasted with Jack's calm, measured pace. They were returning from a long day clearing fallen trees, their chainsaws now silent. The forest filled only with the creak of branches and the whisper of wind. For Jack, these woods were more than just a workplace. They were a kind of refuge. After losing his wife and son in an accident 5 years earlier, he had taken to working deep in the wilderness, where silence felt cleaner and time moved slower. Ethan, on the other hand, still had the fire of youth in him. He had joined the Forestry Service only a year ago, driven by curiosity about geology and a fascination with nature. He admired Jack, though he never said so directly, and their unspoken friendship had grown over months of shared solitude. The trail they followed that evening was one seldom used, a narrow detour around a slope where landslides were common. The fading light turned the forest gold and silver, and for a while they walked without speaking. Then Ethan's flashlight caught something unusual by the side of the trail. "Hey, Jack," he called, lowering his voice. "You see that?" Jack turned, squinting into the dim light. There, half buried under roots and moss, was a large rounded stone. It wasn't like the gray granite boulders common in the Rockies. This one was smooth and almost oval, its surface marked by strange circular ridges and thin cracks that ran like veins across it. Jack stepped closer, crouched, and brushed away the dirt with his glove. "That's not from around here," he muttered. Ethan knelt beside him, his breath visible in the cool air. "It looks almost like an egg," he said, half joking, half in awe. "A dinosaur egg, maybe?" Jack gave him a sidelong look, then turned back to the stone. "If it is," he said quietly, "it's the biggest damn egg I've ever seen." For a moment, they simply stared. The forest seemed to hold its breath. No birds called, no branches swayed. Jack felt a strange unease creep through him. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that they had stumbled on something that didn't belong to their time. He knocked lightly on the surface of the stone. It sounded hollow, or perhaps just less dense than normal rock. "Could be a mineral pocket," he said, though even he didn't believe his own words. Ethan ran his fingers along one of the spiral ridges. The pattern was too deliberate, too organic. He pulled his hand back, shaking off the chill that crawled over his skin. "We should probably tell someone," he said. "The Institute in Denver, maybe." Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, no sense messing with it ourselves. Could be worth something, or dangerous." He marked the spot with a ribbon of red tape from his pack tied to a nearby branch. As they packed up and prepared to leave, Ethan hesitated. "You think anyone's ever seen it before?" Jack looked back at the faint glimmer of the stone through the trees. "If they did," he said, "they didn't stick around long enough to tell about it." They laughed softly, but it was a nervous laugh. The wind shifted, rustling the treetops, and the temperature seemed to drop. Jack turned off his flashlight and looked into the darkness. He had worked in forests his entire life, but that night the silence felt heavier, almost aware. They started back toward camp, the trail narrow and winding. The moon began to rise, casting silver light through the branches. Jack found his thoughts wandering, not to the stone, but to the years he had spent trying to outwalk his grief. Maybe, he thought, the past never really stayed buried. Maybe it just waited under the surface until someone dug it up. Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think it's really a fossil or something?" Jack shrugged. "Could be. Could just be a weird rock. Either way, it's not ours to figure out." Ethan smiled faintly. "You always talk like that, like there's things we shouldn't touch." Jack didn't respond. He didn't have to. He had learned that lesson long ago, the hard way. When they reached camp, the fire had nearly burned out. Jack added a log, sparks spiraling into the air. Ethan sat down, staring into the flames. "You ever get the feeling the forest hides things from us?" he asked. Jack sipped his coffee from a dented metal cup and nodded. "All the time," he said, "and maybe that's for the best." Ethan lay back, looking up at the stars through the breaks in the canopy. The silence between them felt easy again, almost comforting. But Jack's mind stayed on the stone. Its smooth curves, the strange spirals, the way it seemed both dead and alive. He had seen strange things in the mountains, old mining shafts, ancient carvings, even bones, but nothing like this. Later that night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Jack walked to the edge of the camp. The wind had died, and the forest was utterly still. Somewhere out there, in the dark, the stone waited. He imagined it buried deeper once, untouched for centuries, until rain and erosion had revealed it. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't found it by accident, that maybe somehow it had been waiting for them. The moonlight glimmered on the distant trees, and Jack exhaled slowly. "Whatever you are," he whispered into the darkness. "We'll find out soon enough." Then he turned back toward the fire, unaware that the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. The night closed in behind him, silent and patient, as if guarding its secret for one more day. The next morning broke gray and cold over Aspen Ridge, the forest still wet from a night of scattered snow. Jack and Ethan stood near the campfire, finishing a quiet breakfast as the sound of approaching engines echoed faintly through the trees. The team from the Colorado Geological Institute arrived just after sunrise in 2 off-road vehicles, their headlights cutting through the mist. Among them was Dr. Margaret Lane, a seasoned paleontologist with a calm, deliberate presence. Her sharp eyes took in everything: the terrain, the soil, the altitude. Before she even greeted the men who had made the discovery, "You must be Jack Miller," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "And you're Ethan Cole?" Ethan nodded, nervous, but excited. "Yes, ma'am. The rock is just off the trail. You'll want to see it." They led the small team through the forest, boots crunching over frozen leaves. When they reached the site, the morning light caught the strange curves of the stone, now partially uncovered by melting frost. Even the experienced scientists paused. Dr. Lane knelt beside it, tracing a gloved finger over the spirals. "Unusual symmetry," she murmured. "Not volcanic. The texture is too fine." One of her assistants, a geochemist named Brian, tapped the surface with a small hammer and listened. "Not hollow," he said, "but not solid granite either." The group exchanged uncertain looks. Jack stood back, arms crossed, feeling oddly protective of the thing. Dr. Lane ordered a quick scan using a portable spectrometer. The readings appeared on her tablet, and her brows furrowed. "This can't be right," she said softly. "There's organic trace material inside. Proteins, residual structures." Ethan blinked. "You mean it was alive?" She didn't answer immediately, just stood and brushed the dirt from her gloves. "Whatever it is, it's old. Very old." For several hours, the team documented every angle, took soil samples, and debated theories. Some thought it was an ancient fossil. Others speculated about meteorite origins. Brian suggested it could be a concretion, mineral sediment hardened around an object. Dr. Lane remained cautious, avoiding guesses. "We won't know until we open it," she said finally. Jack frowned. "You plan to crack it open here?" "No," she replied. "Not yet. It's too delicate and the temperature's unstable. But we can do a preliminary test to see how deep the fractures run." As the morning wore on, clouds thickened above the mountains and snow began to fall again in thin, slow flakes. Ethan watched the scientists set up their instruments, fascinated. Jack, meanwhile, couldn't shake the sense that something about the find was wrong. He didn't believe in omens, but the silence of the forest, the strange weight of the air, made him uneasy. Even the birds were gone. Dr. Lane noticed his distant look and approached quietly. "You've seen your share of strange things out here, haven't you?" she asked. "Some," Jack said. "Nothing like this." She studied him for a moment. "Sometimes the earth hides its past for a reason," she said. "But sometimes it offers it to us because we're ready to understand it." The team continued their work into the afternoon. Small sensors were placed along the stone's cracks, measuring density and pressure. A generator hummed softly nearby. Every so often, Ethan would ask questions, and the scientist humored him with short, patient answers. He was trying to absorb everything he could, eyes wide with curiosity. Jack admired that, though he couldn't share it. He felt the opposite, pulled to leave, to walk away before whatever was inside revealed itself. When the first test concluded, the readings were inconclusive. "It's too dense for standard rock," Brian said. "But there's a cavity pattern inside." It's not uniform. Dr. Lane pursed her lips. That supports the biological hypothesis. She turned to Jack. You said you found it half exposed. That's right, Jack replied. Didn't move it or touch it more than to clear the dirt. Good, she said. The structure is fragile. We'll need to open it soon before frost expansion does it for us. Ethan stepped closer, excitement flickering in his eyes. You mean you're really going to break it open? Carefully, Dr. Lane said, with precision tools, not brute force. Maybe tomorrow morning once the equipment is ready. They packed their instruments as daylight began to fade, the shadows stretching long between the trees. Dr. Lane spoke quietly with her team about logistics, arranging to camp nearby overnight. Jack and Ethan helped secure the area, driving stakes into the earth. As they worked, Jack looked once more at the spiral shell, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. There was beauty in it, but also a sadness, a reminder that even the most magnificent life could vanish, leaving behind only silence. As night fell, Dr. Lane gathered the team and spoke softly. Tomorrow, we'll begin the extraction. Tonight, we rest. What we found today, it's more than science. It's a glimpse into forever. The group dispersed to their tents, the forest returning to stillness. Jack lingered by the fossil a little longer. The moon rose high above the trees, casting pale light over the clearing. The shell gleamed faintly beneath its cover, almost breathing in the cold air. Jack whispered, "Sleep well, old one." Then he turned away, the forest swallowing his footsteps, the quiet hum of time settling once more around the thing that had waited 100 million years to be seen again. The following days brought a flurry of work and wonder. The fossil, now exposed in its entirety, drew attention from scientists across the state. The clearing in the woods became a makeshift field lab surrounded by tarps and equipment, buzzing with quiet excitement. Jack and Ethan watched as more specialists arrived, each one marveling at the impossible size and perfect preservation of the ancient mollusk. Tests were run, samples carefully removed, and every detail was logged and photographed. Dr. Lane coordinated everything with precise authority, but beneath her professionalism, there was a spark of awe she could not conceal. Late one afternoon, after hours of analysis, she gathered her team around the central table where printouts and data screens flickered with readings. It's confirmed, she said. Based on isotope decay and mineral layering, this fossil is between 110 and 115 million years old. It dates back to the early Cretaceous period. That means when this creature was alive, this entire region was underwater. Silence followed, broken only by the rustle of wind through pine needles. This, she continued, is not just a fossil. It's a geological miracle. The news spread quickly through official channels. Calls came from Denver, from universities, even from museums on the East Coast offering to sponsor the research. An appraisal later valued the fossil at over $300,000, though Dr. Lane refused to talk about money in front of her team. To her, it wasn't about value. It was about meaning. Ethan, however, couldn't help the gleam of pride in his eyes. He was still young enough to dream of discovery as something heroic. You realize what we did, Jack? He said that evening by the fire. We changed science. People will remember this. Jack stirred the embers with a stick, his face lit in orange and shadow. Maybe, he said, or maybe it'll just end up in a museum where kids take pictures and forget what it really means. Ethan frowned. You don't sound happy about it. Jack sighed. I'm proud, sure, but some things feel too big for us, like we're just borrowing something that doesn't belong to our time. Dr. Lane joined them later, a mug of coffee in her hand, her expression thoughtful. He's not wrong, she said quietly. Every discovery like this is a kind of theft from time. We pull something ancient into the present, but it loses the silence that protected it. Ethan looked between them, uncertain. But isn't that the point? To understand it? She smiled faintly. Understanding and owning aren't the same thing. She glanced at Jack. You've seen what time does to people, haven't you? Jack met her gaze, but said nothing. She continued softly. It buries everything. But it's merciful, too. It lets us start over. The next morning, the fossil was carefully prepared for transport. As cranes lifted the shell from its resting place, the air felt charged, as though the forest itself was watching. The workers moved slowly, respectful despite their exhaustion. Once loaded onto a truck bound for Denver, the clearing looked suddenly empty, stripped of its secret. Jack walked around the shallow pit where the fossil had lain. He ran his fingers through the cold earth. "Feels wrong to take it away," he murmured. Ethan, standing beside him, said, "It's going somewhere safe, somewhere people can see it." Jack nodded but didn't answer. Weeks passed, and life returned to routine. The fossil was installed at the Denver Natural History Museum under controlled conditions. Jack and Ethan were invited to the unveiling along with Dr. Lane and her team. The ceremony was quiet but dignified, attended by scientists, journalists, and curious visitors. When the curtain lifted, gasps filled the hall. Under the museum lights, the shell gleamed like a frozen storm, every ridge and curve catching the glow. The plaque beneath it read, "Cretaceous Marine Mollusk, discovered by Jack Miller and Ethan Cole, Aspen Ridge, Colorado." Ethan stood proudly taking photos while Dr. Lane spoke to reporters about the scientific implications. Jack lingered at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. The sight filled him with conflicting feelings: wonder, sadness, and a strange kind of peace. Later, after the crowd dispersed, Dr. Lane found him standing alone in front of the display. "You did good work," she said. Jack smiled faintly. "You mean we didn't ruin it?" She laughed softly. "No, you honored it." They stood in silence for a while, both staring at the fossil. "You know," she said quietly, "some things are preserved because they're meant to remind us how brief we are. We think we've conquered time, but all we've done is borrow a story from it." Jack nodded slowly. "Maybe that's all any of us do." That night, Jack returned to his cabin near the forest. The snow had begun to fall again, coating the pines in white silence. He sat by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out into the darkness. The mountains loomed like ghosts, their peaks lost in cloud. He thought about the fossil resting under bright museum lights, far from the quiet earth that had held it for so long. He thought about his wife and son, about everything time had taken, and what little it had left behind. Maybe he realized that was the point. The world keeps what it needs to remember, even when people don't. Days later, a letter arrived from Dr. Lane. Inside was a photograph of the fossil and a short note. "For those who understand that not all treasures belong to the living." Jack placed the photo on his mantle beside an old family picture. For the first time in years, he felt the ache in his chest ease. The discovery hadn't just changed science. It had reminded him that nothing is truly lost, only transformed. The ancient creature, trapped in stone for millions of years, had become a symbol of endurance. And in its stillness, Jack found his own kind of peace. Spring came late to the Rockies that year, melting the snow in slow, glistening sheets that ran down from the peaks into the forest below. The air carried the scent of wet pine and thawing earth, and Aspen Ridge began to stir with new life. Weeks had passed since the fossil's unveiling in Denver, but for Jack Miller, the memory of that day remained vivid. The world had moved on. Newspapers printing headlines, scientists publishing reports, and the museum attracting crowds of visitors eager to glimpse the ancient shell. Yet for Jack, the discovery had never been about fame or science. It had been something quieter, deeper, a conversation with time itself. One morning, as the first green returned to the mountainsides, Jack packed his old truck and drove toward the forest where it had all begun. The roads were slick with melting snow, and clouds hung low over the ridges. When he reached the trailhead, the silence greeted him like an old friend. He walked slowly, following the same narrow path he and Ethan had taken months before. The air cold but gentle against his skin. The clearing was different now. The place where the fossil had lain was empty, just a shallow indentation in the earth, half filled with rainwater. New grass sprouted along its edges, erasing the traces of men and machines. Jack stood there for a long time, listening to the hush of the woods. He could almost hear echoes of the past, the distant hum of generators, the soft murmur of Dr. Lane's voice, Ethan's laughter. Now there was only the wind. He crouched down and placed his hand on the damp soil. "You can rest again," he whispered. The forest answered with a sigh through the trees. He didn't feel sadness this time, only gratitude. The fossil had found its place in the world. And so, in a way, had he. Later that day, he drove to Denver to visit the museum. The hall was quieter now, the initial rush of visitors replaced by small groups and families. The great fossil stood in its glass case, illuminated by soft golden light. Children pressed their faces against the barrier, whispering in awe, while parents read the plaque aloud. Jack moved closer until his reflection merged with the spiral of the shell. The ancient lines curved inward endlessly, drawing his gaze deeper, and he felt again the strange connection that had bound him to it since the moment they found it. Dr. Lane appeared beside him, her presence calm, as always. "You came back," she said softly. Jack nodded. "Didn't think I would, but I guess I needed to see it one last time." She looked at the fossil, her expression unreadable. "It's remarkable, isn't it? How something so old can make us feel so small." "Small," Jack said, "and lucky." They walked together for a while, speaking little. At one point she turned to him and said, "You know, the museum decided to dedicate this entire section to marine life from that era. Your discovery became the foundation of something larger." He smiled faintly. "Good. It deserves that." Dr. Lane hesitated. "You've changed since the day we met in the forest." Jack thought about it and nodded. "I guess I stopped running from the past. Finding this thing, it made me realize time doesn't destroy everything. Sometimes it keeps things safe." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "That's the most human way I've ever heard anyone describe geology." They both laughed quietly, and for a moment, the heaviness that had followed him for years lifted. As the afternoon light faded, Jack said his goodbyes and stepped out into the city street. The noise and movement of Denver surrounded him, yet his mind was still in the quiet forest. On the drive home, the sky turned a deep violet, and the first stars appeared above the mountains. He pulled over at a lookout point and sat on the hood of his truck, watching the horizon darken. Somewhere beyond those peaks, the forest waited, eternal and unchanged. He thought about Ethan, who had moved on to study geology at the university, full of purpose and promise. He thought about Dr. Lane, who continued her work with the same grace and discipline. And he thought about his family, long gone but never erased. Everything, he realized, was part of the same story, a story written not in years, but in layers of earth and memory. When he finally returned home, the cabin was quiet. He lit a small fire and took the photograph Dr. Lane had sent him from the mantel. The image of the fossil gleamed softly under the flickering light. He set it beside a worn picture of his wife and son, their smiles forever frozen in another kind of time. For a while he sat there, listening to the crackle of the flames, the night outside stretching endless and calm. Eventually, he rose and stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low above the trees, silver and full, and the forest below shimmered with 1,000 reflections from melting snow. He breathed deeply, the air cool and clean, and whispered to the wind, "We didn't just find a fossil. We found proof that nothing truly disappears." Somewhere far away in the museum's quiet hall, the fossil lay under its light, eternal and silent, its spirals curling inward like the memory of a heartbeat. And in the mountains where it once slept, new life pushed through the soil, reclaiming the space it had left behind. The world continued as it always had, carrying the echoes of everything that ever was. Jack stood for a long time, watching the night until the fire inside the cabin burned low. When he finally went back in and closed the door, the forest seemed to breathe again, as if whispering its approval. In that moment, he understood that some discoveries are not about what we unearth, but about what we awaken within ourselves. And as the quiet settled around him, Jack Miller felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace. What would you do if you found something like this? Share your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe and like.